The Pacific Ocean, 1943. Aboard the Imperial Japanese submarine I-19, Lieutenant Commander Tanaka adjusted the focus on his binoculars. The sea was a vast, empty canvas of grey. For weeks, they had hunted, their mission to strangle the American supply lines, to isolate their island garrisons, and watch them wither on the vine. It was a strategy of subtle, surgical suffocation. Then he saw it, a smudge on the horizon. Tanaka's experienced eye scanned the silhouette, searching for the telltale lines of a warship, a cruiser perhaps, or a valuable aircraft carrier. But the shape that hardened in the lens was wrong. It was slab-sided, clumsy, a floating shoebox, a grotesque parody of a vessel. He lowered his binoculars, a smirk playing on his lips. He reported the contact to the captain, a merchant vessel captain, one of their Liberty ships. He almost spat the name. In the officers' mess of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Liberty ship was a joke. They were the ugly ducklings, the emergency constructions. To men who revered the intricate craftsmanship of the Mitsubishi Zero, a fighter plane so light and agile it was an extension of the pilot's will. The Liberty ship was an abomination. It was brute force engineering, devoid of soul, of honor. This disdain was a calculated doctrine. In Tokyo, the strategists knew their empire could never outbuild the American industrial colossus. Theirs was a philosophy of quality over quantity. A single, perfectly tempered samurai sword could defeat a dozen crude clubs. Their ships, their aircraft were works of art. The American approach was an assembly line. It was vulgar, but on the surface the reality was different. The submarine closed in for the kill. The order to fire was given. A torpedo streaked through the water. It struck the Liberty ship amidships. A tremendous explosion tore through the quiet sea. The vessel, the SS John Murray, shuddered, listed, and within the hour was gone. A victory. Tanaka recorded the kill in his log. One more nail in the coffin of American logistics. But the next day, as the I-19 patrolled the same sea lane, the lookouts called out again. Not one target, three. The same ugly, boxy silhouettes. The same slow, plodding progress. The submarine attacked again. 2 more ships were sent to the bottom. Another entry in the log. A triumphant return to port was anticipated. Yet a week later, back on station, the joke began to curdle. The radio intercept spoke of convoys, not of 3 or 4 ships, but of 40. The lookouts reported contacts not just on the horizon, but spanning it. They were everywhere. Sinking them felt less like a victory, and more like trying to drain the ocean with a teacup. For every one they sent to the depths, it seemed 2 more took its place. The Americans weren't just building ships. They were seeding the ocean with them. The Liberty ship was no longer a joke. It was a statistical nightmare. It was not a sword to be parried, but a tide to be held back. And the tide was rising. Each one carried the weight of a war. Sherman tanks for MacArthur, aviation fuel for the bombers over Ploiești, rations for the Red Army at Stalingrad. They were the unglamorous, unstoppable pack mules of a global war, and their sheer numbers were rewriting the rules of engagement. The katana was sharp, but it was being blunted against an avalanche of raw, industrial might. The initial mockery in the wardrooms of Tokyo had turned to a cold, silent dread. The question was no longer about the quality of the weapon, but the terrifying scale of its production. How could a ship, mocked for its simplicity, become the weapon that would sink an empire? In the shipyards of Kobe and Yokohama, building a warship was a sacred craft. It was a symphony of skilled hands, where master welders, like blacksmiths of old, joined plates of steel with seams so perfect they were works of art. Each vessel was an individual, a unique expression of naval engineering, bearing the name of a mountain or a celestial phenomenon. The Zero fighter, the pride of the empire, was a testament to this philosophy. Lightweight, incredibly maneuverable, a masterpiece of minimalism that required a master pilot to unlock its potential. To the Japanese military mind, war was a duel of spirit and skill. Quality was a moral imperative. This belief was rooted in a stark industrial reality. Japan produced less steel in a year than the state of Pennsylvania produced in a month. They could not afford waste. They could not afford to be clumsy. Every ounce of material, every hour of labor, had to be invested in a weapon of unparalleled excellence. Their strategy was built on this foundation. A rapid, decisive blow, a Pearl Harbor on a grand scale that would shatter the enemy's will before America's sleeping industrial giant could even stir. It was a bet that their samurai spirit, embodied in their exquisitely crafted weapons, could overcome sheer mass. Across the Pacific, a different religion was being practiced. In the vast, sprawling shipyards of Richmond, California and Portland, Oregon, the goal was not to create a masterpiece, but to erase the very concept of individuality from shipbuilding. Here the symphony was not of craftsmen, but of cranes and rivet guns. The sound was not a delicate hammer, but the deafening, relentless roar of industry. The American answer was not a better ship. It was a process. The Liberty ship's design was brutally simplified. Its engine was not a modern turbine, but a triple expansion steam engine, a relic from a bygone era chosen for one reason. It could be built by automobile factories that had never seen a ship. Parts were standardized, prefabricated in factories thousands of miles inland and shipped to the coast like a massive nationwide erector set. The ship itself was assembled not by master shipwrights, but by welders and laborers trained in weeks. To a Japanese engineer, this was heresy. It was a cheap shortcut, a clumsy, inefficient parody of true shipbuilding. They saw the Liberty ship's rough welds and simple lines as proof of American inferiority, but this disdain was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Americans were not fighting a duel. They were waging a war of arithmetic. The equation was simple. How many tons of supplies could be moved across the oceans faster than the enemy could sink them? The complex, beautiful warships of the Imperial Navy were like exquisite hand-painted arrows. America was building a mountain of crude rocks, and they were building it with a speed that defied imagination. The Japanese bet on a short war, won by the quality of their initial blow. America was preparing for a long war, won by the overwhelming, relentless quantity of its production. The two philosophies were on a collision course, one refined in the quiet halls of naval academies, the other born on the deafening, smoky assembly lines of a nation unleashing its industrial soul. The master craftsmen of the East had spent decades perfecting the ultimate weapon, but shortcuts in peace can mean survival in war. The American response was not confined to drawing boards. It was a physical transformation of the coastline. From the foggy shores of Richmond, California, to the gritty ports of Portland, Maine, landscapes were reshaped. Where there were once quiet docks, colossal new shipyards emerged almost overnight, their skeletons of steel and concrete sprawling across the water's edge like mechanical beasts. These were not mere docks. They were assembly lines on an oceanic scale. The architect of this revolution was an industrialist named Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship before the war. He saw shipbuilding not as a craft, but as a logistical problem. His yards were designed for flow, not finesse. Prefabricated sections, a bow here, a section of deck there, an engine block, were constructed miles away from the water. They were then transported on massive rail cars to the fitting-out docks, where they were welded together in a process as methodical as assembling a car. The ship moved down the line, growing from a keel to a hull to a complete vessel in a matter of days. The Japanese built ships. Kaiser printed them, but steel and concrete were nothing without human hands. And with millions of men in uniform, a new army was conscripted for the home front. They came from farms in the Midwest, from small towns in the South, from kitchens and schools across the nation. They were women now, Rosie the riveter, trading aprons for welders' masks, their hair tied back in bandanas, their hands learning the weight of a rivet gun. They were retired mechanics, immigrants, and men deemed unfit for combat, a cross-section of America mobilized for a single staggering purpose. The training was swift, brutal, and focused. A worker didn't need to know how to build an entire ship. They needed to master one task. One team became specialists in welding vertical seams. Another mastered the installation of deck cleats. A third did nothing but paint hull numbers. This hyper-specialization turned complex art into simple, repeatable industry. The soul of the master shipwright was replaced by the relentless, coordinated rhythm of the assembly line. The learning curve was steep, littered with mistakes and inefficiencies in the early days. But soon, the rhythm took hold. The shipyards operated on a scale that defied the day-night cycle. Under the blinding glare of arc lights, the work continued 24 hours a day. The air thick with the smell of ozone from welding torches and the acrid tang of fresh paint. The sound was a constant physical presence, a roar that became the heartbeat of the war effort. Each yard was a city unto itself, with its own schools, hospitals and shops, all dedicated to feeding the machine that was building the fleet. This human tide, initially unskilled and chaotic, began to coalesce. A sense of mission took root, fueled by newsreels from the front and the understanding that every welded seam was a thread in the lifeline to a soldier overseas. Productivity soared. What took months in 1942 was taking weeks by 1943. The initial skepticism of old-school naval engineers evaporated in the face of the raw numbers. Rolling down the slips and into the water, it was a messy, loud, and utterly revolutionary process. It was democracy translated into industry, a mobilization of the entire population, each person a cog in a machine of unprecedented scale. They were not building works of art, they were building tools for survival. And from this human tide came a new miracle: speed. In the silent, wood-paneled war rooms of Tokyo, the pins on the vast map of the Pacific told a story of victory. Each pin represented a confirmed Allied merchant vessel sunk. Submarine commanders filed triumphant reports. Naval aviators documented strikes. The arithmetic of attrition was supposed to be simple: sink ships faster than the enemy can build them. For the first months of 1942, the math held. The U-boat packs in the Atlantic and the I-boats in the Pacific were bleeding the Allied supply lines white. But then, the arithmetic broke. The pins were being placed at a record pace. Yet the convoys crossing the ocean seemed to grow larger, not smaller. It was as if for every ship they sent to the bottom, two more emerged from the American coastline. Naval intelligence analysts presented reports that were dismissed as fantasy. The numbers couldn't be real. A ship, any ship, required a year to build. It was a fundamental law of naval engineering. But America was rewriting the laws of physics. The miracle was happening on the fitting-out docks of Kaiser's shipyards. The process, once refined, became a blur of controlled chaos. The goal was no longer measured in months, but in days. The shipyard workers, now a well-oiled machine, turned it into a sport, a point of national pride. They competed against their own records, their shifts fueled by a fierce determination. The world watched in stunned disbelief as the headlines flashed: Liberty ship built in 5 days. New record, keel to launch in 4. The ultimate feat was the SS Robert E. Peary. Launched on November 12, 1942, it was assembled in an astonishing 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after its keel was laid. To the Japanese command, this was not an industrial achievement. It was a form of sorcery. How could steel be tempered, hulls be sealed, engines be installed, and 1,000 systems be integrated in less time than it took a naval courier to sail from Tokyo to Singapore? It violated every principle of craftsmanship they held sacred. A master carpenter would spend longer on a single piece of furniture. This was not craftsmanship. This was a new form of warfare, industrial warfare. The Liberty ships were not built to last for decades. They were built to make a single vital journey, or 2 or 3. They were disposable lighters, ferrying the lifeblood of war across the ocean. Their durability was not in their individual hulls, but in their overwhelming numbers. A submarine might spend its entire patrol sinking 3 of them, exhausting its torpedoes and risking destruction from escorting destroyers. Yet by the time that submarine returned to port for resupply, the shipyard that built those 3 lost vessels would have launched 30 more. The sheer velocity of production created a psychological shockwave that rippled all the way to the front lines. For a Japanese soldier on a remote island, the war was measured in the dwindling supplies of rice and ammunition. For an American Marine, it was measured in the constant arrival of new tanks, fresh troops, and endless crates of rations. The slow, plodding Liberty ship became the symbol of this inexorable tide. It wasn't fast. It wasn't fearsome. But it was relentless. The Imperial Navy's strategy of attrition was based on a fatal miscalculation. They were trying to drain a well, but America had replaced the well with an ocean. The sinkings continued, but they became meaningless statistics. Drops of water evaporated from the surface of a sea that only grew deeper. The admiral stared at their maps, the pins now looking less like victories and more like desperate, futile gestures against an inevitable flood. They had mastered the art of sinking ships, but they had no answer for a nation that could replace them overnight. But what cargo did these floating boxes carry that made them so dangerous? The true power of the Liberty ship was not in its steel plates or its obsolete engine. It was in the void within its hull, the vast, dark, echoing holds that stretched the length of the vessel. These empty spaces were the arteries of the Allied war machine, and what they carried was nothing less than the means to victory itself. In the suffocating heat of a Guadalcanal jungle, a Marine rifleman fires the last round from his M1 Garand. The distinctive ping of the ejected clip is a sound of vulnerability. 1,000 miles away, in the frozen mud of a British tank depot in North Africa, engineers cannibalize 3 broken-down Shermans to get one running. These are moments of desperation, the points where battles are lost. The Liberty ship was the answer to that desperation. Each vessel was a floating warehouse, a miracle of logistics. Crammed into its holds was the tangible substance of global power. Here, in the damp darkness, were stacks of artillery shells, each one destined for a German position in the hills of Italy. There, chained to the deck, were rows of brand-new Sherman tanks, their olive-drab paint fresh, their guns silent until they rolled onto a beachhead. In refrigerated compartments were thousands of pounds of frozen beef and crates of dried eggs, the calories that would fuel the advance of an army. The most precious cargo was the most volatile, aviation fuel in vast, sloshing tanks, without which the P-51 Mustangs could not clear the skies of the Luftwaffe, and high-octane gasoline for the trucks that carried the Red Army from Stalingrad to Berlin. A single Liberty ship could carry enough fuel to power an entire armored division for a week of brutal combat. For the Japanese soldier, isolated on a captured island, the war became a slow, grinding process of starvation. Their supplies, dependent on fragile transport ships and daring nighttime runs by destroyers, dwindled to nothing. They fought on empty stomachs, with limited ammunition, watching the skies for planes that never came. For the American Marine on the opposite side of the same island, the war was a thing of grim abundance. New supplies landed daily, not just bullets and beans, but mail from home, new boots and medical supplies. This contrast was not an accident of battle. It was the direct result of the slow, steady, unbreakable chain of Liberty ships stretching all the way back to California. The cargo manifests were a dry accounting of overwhelming force, but for the men on the ground, it was the difference between hope and despair. The arrival of a convoy was a psychological event as much as a logistical one. It meant they were not forgotten. It meant the machine behind them was still functioning. It meant that for every round they fired, 10 more were already on the way. The Japanese Naval Command, analyzing intercepted radio traffic and prisoner interrogations, began to understand this new reality. Sinking a warship was a clear victory. Sinking a troop transport was a tactical triumph. But sinking a Liberty ship? It was like trying to stop a river by removing a single bucket of water. The cargo was lost, yes. The tanks, the fuel, the food would never reach their destination. But the system was impervious to such losses. The ship itself was the least valuable part of the equation. It was the disposable container. The real value was the industrial might that filled it, and the shipyard that could produce its identical twin in a matter of days. And the Japanese soon realized sinking one ship meant nothing if 10 more took its place. From the depths, the hunters watched. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine fleet was a pack of wolves, designed to stalk and tear at the soft underbelly of Allied supply lines. Their mission was clear: isolate the battlefield, starve the front, make the cost of waging war across the Pacific so high that America would sue for peace. In the early days, it worked. A lone freighter silhouetted against the sunset was easy prey. A single torpedo, a brilliant flash, and another pin was added to the map in Tokyo. But the nature of the hunt changed. The lone freighter became a convoy, and the convoys became armadas. The wolves now found themselves facing not solitary sheep, but a moving city of steel, protected by a screen of snarling destroyers and corvettes. The sea lanes became deadly gauntlets, but not for the merchants. For the hunters, a Japanese submarine commander would spend days tracking a convoy, maneuvering for a perfect firing solution. The order would be given. Torpedoes would streak away. An explosion would rip through the night. A Liberty ship, the SS John Lawson, would shudder, break its back and slide beneath the waves. A victory, but in the chaos that followed, the depth charges raining down, the sonar pings hunting them, the commander would periscope again. The convoy had not stopped. It had not even slowed. It steamed on, a relentless, disciplined formation, leaving the dying ship and its valiant crew behind. The gap in the line simply closed. The arithmetic of the hunt became insane. A submarine might expend its entire payload of torpedoes to sink 2, perhaps 3 ships. It was a tactical success, but strategically it was a failure. That submarine would then have to break contact, evade the escorts, and embark on a long, dangerous journey back to port to rearm and refuel. That process could take weeks. In those same weeks, the shipyards of America would have launched an entire new convoy. The Hunter was exhausting itself trying to drain an ocean. The technological tide turned against them. Allied escorts were equipped with radar that could see through the night and fog, negating the submarine's greatest advantage. Hedgehog launchers and depth charges made the depths a lethal environment. The wolves were being thinned out, while the flock they were hunting seemed to multiply exponentially. For every Liberty ship sunk, a Japanese submarine was lost. It was an exchange rate the Empire could not sustain. On the surface, the Liberty ship sailors, merchant marines, faced a special kind of hell. They were civilians, but they sailed into a war zone, knowing their slow, ungainly vessel was a prime target. They manned deck guns, but their only real protection was the sheer, anonymous bulk of their ship and the hope that the escorts would keep the wolves at bay. Theirs was a courage born not of offensive power, but of sheer, stubborn endurance. Back in Japan, the reports from submarine commanders took on a desperate, bewildered tone. They spoke of endless streams of targets, of convoys so large they stretched beyond the horizon. The initial thrill of the hunt had been replaced by a grim, soul-crushing realization. They were not losing because their torpedoes were faulty or their tactics were poor. They were losing because they were facing something beyond tactics, a fundamental law of industrial physics, and the Japanese engineers faced a haunting truth. The enemy was building ships faster than they could sink them. The true miracle of the Liberty ship was not forged in the fires of the steel mill, but in the hearts of the people. While the ships sailed into battle, a second army fought its own war on the home front. This army was not composed of soldiers, but of citizens. They were the human tide that powered the arsenal of democracy, and their weapon was production. They arrived by the trainload, from the dust bowls of Oklahoma and the quiet main streets of New England. They were waitresses, school teachers, and farmers' sons. They were African Americans fleeing the segregated South for the promise of high-paying war work in the North and West. They were women, millions of them, stepping into roles they had been told were for men alone. Rosie the Riveter was more than a propaganda poster. She was a reality, her face shielded by a welder's mask. Her hands, once skilled at sewing and cooking, now mastering the violent dance of the pneumatic rivet gun. The shipyards became great melting pots of American society. A former sharecropper from Alabama worked alongside a Swedish immigrant from Minnesota. A grandmother from Indiana learned to read complex blueprints. They were given not years of apprenticeship, but weeks of crash training. Their mission was singular: master one task and perform it with relentless, perfect repetition. One woman might spend her entire war doing nothing but welding the same seam on a ship's hull, thousands of times over. She would never sail on it, never see it completed, but she knew its purpose. This was industrial democracy in action. The hierarchy was not one of birthright or class, but of efficiency and output. Henry Kaiser, the master of this new army, understood that morale was a resource as vital as steel. He provided health care, built childcare centers, and created communities around his yards. He made his workers feel valued, and in return, they performed miracles. They worked double shifts, their bodies aching, their minds numb with fatigue, but driven by a shared understanding. Every welded plate was a layer of armor for a son in a tank. Every installed engine was a heartbeat for a brother on a troop ship. The spirit was one of fierce, patriotic competition. Yard against yard, shift against shift. They posted giant scoreboards tracking their progress. The goal was not just to meet a quota, but to shatter it, to prove what free people united by a common cause could achieve. The launch of a ship became a community celebration, with the workers who built it cheering as their creations slid into the water. Named for a founding father or a fallen hero, this human wave was the factor Japanese planners could never quantify. They could measure steel output and count shipyard cranes, but they could not measure the will of a mobilized nation. Their own society, rigid and hierarchical, could not replicate this explosive, decentralized energy. Their workforce was dedicated, but it was not unleashed in the same way. America's strength was not just in its factories, but in its people. Their adaptability, their ingenuity, and their sheer, overwhelming numbers, all channeled into a single, monumental effort. The initial trickle of ships became a flood. The first 100 were an achievement. The next 500, a statement. The shipyards, once struggling to meet demand, were now exceeding all expectations, their output curves shooting upwards in a steep, unbroken line, and the numbers kept climbing into the thousands. The numbers ceased to be statistics and became a physical law, a force of nature. By the war's end, the United States had not just built a fleet. It had built a new coastline out of floating steel. The total would reach 2,710 Liberty ships. To comprehend this number is to understand the scale of the American industrial miracle. Imagine a single ship, the SS John W. Brown, a typical Liberty. It was 441 feet long. If you were to line up all 2,710 Liberty ships end to end, the line would stretch for over 100 miles. It would be a continuous wall of steel, a floating bridge, longer than the entire coastline of California. Their combined gross tonnage was greater than the entire merchant fleets of every other nation on Earth, combined at the start of the war. This was the steel flood. It was an output that dwarfed the Axis powers' capabilities entirely. While Japanese shipyards, still relying on traditional, time-intensive methods, might launch a handful of vessels each month, American yards were launching multiple ships per day. The total Japanese merchant shipping tonnage built during the entire war was less than a third of the Liberty ship output alone. They were not just losing the production race. They were competing in an entirely different league. The impact was logistical and psychological. Each one of those 2,710 ships was a repeatable unit of carrying capacity. They formed a conveyor belt across the Atlantic and Pacific that never stopped moving. This allowed for stockpiles of staggering proportions. For the D-Day landings in Normandy, the Allies had built up such a massive reserve of supplies in England that the invasion could proceed even in the face of terrible Channel weather. They could afford to wait for the right moment. The Japanese, by contrast, were living hand-to-mouth, their operations constantly constrained by a lack of fuel, spare parts, and raw materials. The Liberty ship became a universal tool. While most were standard cargo carriers, hundreds were adapted into specialized roles. They became troop transports, carrying the vast American army to foreign shores. They became hospital ships, painted white with red crosses, their holds converted into wards for the wounded. They became repair ships, aircraft ferries, and floating warehouses. This versatility meant that the basic, simple design could be molded to fit any need the war presented. The very simplicity the Japanese mocked was the source of its greatest strength. For the Japanese High Command, watching from afar, the numbers were an unsolvable equation. Their strategy had been based on fighting a limited war against a resource-rich but soft democracy. They believed America lacked the will for a long, bloody conflict. The 2010 Liberty ships were the ultimate rebuttal. They were not just ships. They were 2,710 declarations of unwavering resolve. Each launch was a message: we can do this forever. The Empire's war machine, built for a short, sharp conflict, was being ground down by the sheer, inexorable weight of production. Their exquisite weapons, the products of years of craftsmanship, were being overwhelmed by a tidal wave of simplicity. The katana was being blunted not by a superior sword, but by a million hammer blows. But the true proof of victory was not in the yards, it was on the oceans. The Pacific War was not won by a single glorious battle. It was won by 1,000 grim, bloody landings on 1,000 forgotten pieces of coral and jungle. And every one of those landings was fed, fueled, and armed by the Liberty ships. They were the unbreakable thread connecting the American homeland to the farthest reaches of the empire it was. Dismantling, the strategy was island hopping, but it was really a war of logistics. Before the first Marine hit the beach at Guadalcanal in August of 1942, a fleet of these ungainly freighters had already delivered the bulldozers to carve an airfield out of the jungle. They brought the anti-aircraft guns to defend it, the aviation fuel to power the wildcats that would fly from it, and the endless crates of rations to sustain the defenders. The Liberty ship was the first to arrive, and it was the last to leave, a constant, reassuring presence off every hostile shore. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, the victory was secured not just by the courage of the sailors on the front line, but by the oilers, many of them converted Liberty ships that had refueled the great American fleet at sea, allowing it to remain on station and intercept the Japanese Navy. While Japanese admirals hesitated, constrained by strict fuel rationing, American commanders operated with a freedom granted by this endless stream of floating fuel tanks. For the Japanese soldier, the war became a slow, agonizing constriction. Their garrisons on bypassed islands were left to wither on the vine, as the American strategy intended. Cut off from supplies, their ships sunk by submarines, and their supply convoys annihilated from the air, they starved. They watched American planes darken the sky, knowing each one represented gallons of fuel delivered by a ship they could not stop. They faced American tanks on the beaches, knowing the steel for each one had crossed an ocean they once controlled. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was slowly strangled. Its magnificent warships, like the mighty Yamato, were rendered impotent. The Yamato's final suicidal mission to Okinawa in April 1945 was a testament to this defeat. It sailed with only enough fuel for a one-way trip, a symbol of an empire bled dry. It was sunk by American carrier aircraft long before it could reach its target, aircraft that flew on fuel, delivered by the very freighters the Japanese had dismissed. The ocean, which Japan had sought to dominate, became its prison. The sea lanes were now American highways. The ugly ducklings, plodding and defenseless, had achieved what a fleet of battleships could not. They had conquered the water itself, not by fighting, but by simply existing in such overwhelming numbers that the concept of interdiction became a fantasy. The Japanese Navy had been designed to win a decisive battle. It was utterly unprepared for a war of attrition against a foe who could replace losses before they were even confirmed. The tide had turned irrevocably. The initiative, seized by Japan at Pearl Harbor, had been wrenched away by the relentless, grinding power of American industry, carried on the backs of these humble ships. The Empire's conquests were now isolated pockets, besieged and starving, while the American war machine, growing stronger with every passing day, closed in on the home islands, and by the end, Japan's engineers could only watch in disbelief as the ugly ducklings drowned their empire. When the guns fell silent in August of 1945, the victory was signed aboard the battleship USS Missouri, a symbol of immense naval power. But the peace that followed was built by the workhorses waiting in the harbors. The Liberty ships. Their war was over, but their service was not. Their final powerful testament was not in their combat record, but in their enduring utility. In the years that followed, the ugly ducklings became the backbone of the global economic recovery. Sold to private companies or provided as aid, they carried grain to a starving Europe, machinery to a rebuilding Asia, and hope to a shattered world. The SS John W. Brown and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien survive to this day as museum ships, their weathered decks a tangible link to an era when their simple, robust design helped save democracy. They sailed on for decades, a quiet rebuttal to their early critics. The legacy of the Liberty ship is a lesson in the true nature of power. Japan's strategy, focused on the decisive, qualitative blow, was the last glorious gasp of an older way of war. America's strategy, based on the relentless quantitative output of the Liberty ship, was the grim face of the future. It proved that in the industrial age, the capacity to produce, to replace, to repair, to overwhelm, was the ultimate weapon. The will of a free people, channeled through the assembly line, could outlast any doctrine of spiritual supremacy. For the Japanese engineers and strategists who had once scoffed, the war was a brutal education. They had mastered the art of the sword, but they had failed to understand the power of the forge. Their exquisite weapons were defeated not by superior craftsmanship, but by an unimaginable volume of production. The laughter that once echoed in their war rooms died in their throats, replaced by the silent, chilling realization that they had been defeated by a principle they never considered: democratic resilience. Mobilized on an epic scale, the Liberty ship's story is one of profound irony. Mocked for its simplicity, it became a symbol of sophisticated logistical genius. Designed to be expendable, many outlived the warships built to destroy them. Created as a mere stopgap, it became the vessel that carried the Allies to victory. It was a tool, not a jewel, and in a total war, a reliable tool is infinitely more valuable. The lesson echoes through history, a universal truth about preparation and hidden strength. It is not always the most brilliant or complex solution that prevails, but the most robust, the most scalable, the most resilient. The Liberty ship stands as a monument to the power of the practical, the strength of the collective, and the undeniable fact that endurance can be a more potent force than any single, spectacular strike. For Japan's engineers, the laughter died quickly. For the Allies, the Liberty ship was proof that in modern war, steel and speed could change history overnight. It was the humble, unglamorous freighter, the floating boxcar, that ultimately carried the weight of freedom and delivered it, one vital load at a time, to a world desperate for dawn.